Okay, we are live. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gabby, and I am here with two very special guests from the research side of Boys Town National Research Hospital. And today we're going to be talking all about research in as it relates to Better Speech and Hearing Month. So, welcome, both of you. I will have you both introduce yourselves. I probably won't do you as good of justice. So, Karla, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. So my name is Karla McGregor, and I'm the director of the Center for Childhood Deafness, Language, and Learning at Boys Town. And we're located in the East Hospital on 30th, but we also have an outpost on the West Campus. So maybe we'll see you in one of those locations.
Yes, great. And then Krystal?
Hi, I'm Krystal Werfel, and I'm a research scientist in the Center for Childhood Deafness, Language, and Learning, and I direct the Written Language Lab.
Awesome. Well, it's so great to have you both. I was just telling them before this live started, on the Facebook page, have done so many interviews with different physicians and nurses and other specialties at Boys Town, but it's really great to loop in research. So we're really grateful to have you. Okay,
Nice to be
so
here.
Karla, will you go ahead and tell us more about the Center for Childhood Deafness, Language, and Learning at Boys Town?
Sure, absolutely. We are a center of about 90 people, and we have educational programs, clinical programs, and also research programs for children who need help communicating, essentially. So these could be children who have a language disorder, or maybe they're deaf or hard of hearing. Maybe they've had a surgery to repair a cleft palate, and so they need help developing their speech. So those are the kinds of children who need our services, and our research is meant to be highly translational and to sort of move forward the quality of the services that we can provide.
Awesome. So, what kind of research on the other side does the Word Learning Lab and the Written Language Learning Lab do? If you want to each talk about your labs.
Sure. So I direct the Word Learning Lab, and we do exactly what the name says. So we conduct research on how children build their vocabularies and what kinds of strategies speech language pathologists, teachers, parents can use to help children add lots of words to their vocabularies. We are particularly interested in knowing how best to help children build rich word knowledge, because we know how important that is for their academic success and learning to read. Which probably is a nice segue to Krystal, you talking about the written language lab.
It's a perfect segue. So, in the Written Language Lab, we're really focused on improving reading and writing outcomes for children who have communication difficulties. And we focus primarily on children who are deaf and hard of hearing, and how does hearing loss intersect with reading and writing, and what are strategies that we can use as speech language pathologists or classroom teachers to really help children have more success learning to read and write. We also work with children with developmental language disorder in a similar vein.
Yeah, great. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning, so I'm going to say it now. But if any of you are watching live and you have questions about, anything related to research or whatever we're talking about, feel free to leave them in the comment section of this video and we can get. Okay, so very interesting. What new studies are going on that we can chat about?
Well, I'd like to focus on two. So there are two postdoctoral scholars in my lab, and they each have a new project going on right now that I think they're both very exciting. So Dr. Erin Smolak is one of those investigators, and she's asking questions about the role of prediction in understanding the language you hear. So, to give an example, a very obvious example, if I said the dog chased the, you're probably thinking ahead of me and maybe thinking cat or maybe squirrel,
Yeah.
right? So you sort of anticipate what's coming even before the words kind of reach your ear, reach your brain. And she's asking how important that is for facilitating language comprehension. And also, I think an interesting twist is what happens when children make the wrong prediction? Is that sort of a important moment of learning for them, right? To revise that prediction, maybe improves their understanding of the language that they hear later on. So I think that's a really cool study. And she's using a technology called eye tracking. So the child listens to these, nothing is hooked to the child at all. So the child is like, for the child, it just feels like watching a video, right, in front of the computer screen. But there's a little camera in the screen that's tracking the child's eyes as the child listens. And so we can monitor the eye movements to get some ideas about what the child is predicting is going to happen next by where the child looks. So that's a really cool study. And then Dr. Ron Pomper is also a postdoctoral scholar in my lab, and he's asking questions about how to best teach children new words. The question it's one of those beautiful questions that seems quite simple, but I think the results are quite powerful.
Yeah.
So the question is basically, is it useful to hear the new word before you encounter what it refers to or its meaning, or is it better to couple those exposures together? And he's actually finding that early on, if you get to hear the word before you need to process the meaning, children tend to learn and remember better. So again, I think very practical kinds of question, but powerful sorts of answers.
Yeah. Gosh, that is so cool.
How about you, Chris?
I was gonna. Oh, sorry, Karla.
No,
I
I
was
was
gonna
just
highlight
saying,
You're good.
two studies as well. So the main study that we have in the written language lab is called the Ella study, and it's early language and literacy acquisition in children with hearing loss. And what we're really interested in this study is building profiles of early literacy skills. So we start seeing children when they're 4 years old, and we see them every 6 months until they turn 6. We actually, just last weekend, we finished our very last 6-year-old
Oh,
session. So we've just wrapped up all of the data collection. And now our goal is to build these profiles to see what are the areas of strength in early literacy skills. So we're looking at things like letter knowledge. Do you know the names of letters? Do you know the sounds of letters? Do you know how sounds work in words? So can you do things like pick out rhyming words? Can you identify words that start with the same sound? And so really playing with the sounds of words. And we're also interested in language skills. So what's your vocabulary? What kind of grammar skills do you have? And building profiles of areas of real strength for children who are deaf and hard of hearing, and areas where, as speech language pathologists or early interventionists, we could spend a lot of time intervening to boost up those skills. And then our long-term goal is to continue following these children as they go through elementary and middle school and identify, are there areas that we can see in preschool that are really cluing us in to you're going to have more difficulty in elementary school learning to read. And that leads me to the second study. So are there intervention approaches we can use in preschool that help eliminate that difficulty later on? So instead of waiting to see if you have trouble learning to read in elementary school, can we in preschool provide specific kinds of teaching that help eliminate your difficulty later? So we're in the fall planning to start up a new study where we're doing telepractice based intervention in early literacy skills for children who are deaf and hard of hearing.
yeah. Wow. I mean, you probably build so many good relationships with those kids and families going from just a few months old all the way, to 6, 7 years old and beyond. So that's great to know that, if a viewer watching is interested in getting a child into one of these studies, that they really do, hold your hand and carry you year by year. So that's really cool. Awesome. So you kind of both talked a little bit about the goals of these studies and what, is there anything else you'd like to add to let everyone watching know about your studies?
You know, I think one of your questions is why are these studies or even these types of studies important? And it's Better Speech and Hearing Month, so it's probably a really good time to say one reason these kinds of studies are important is because communication challenges are pretty common. So a very rough estimate, if we sort of added together, the various reasons why children have difficulty learning to talk or speak or comprehend spoken language, probably about 10% of all children have some communication disorder or challenge. So these are not rare conditions; they're pretty common.
Yeah.
So there's many children that could be helped by what we learn, and of course, we feel very privileged to be doing this kind of research within the same building as the clinical services take place, because one of the important reasons for doing this research is to inform clinical practice, make it more efficient, make it more effective. And of course, it works both ways. We also, as researchers, learn a lot from the clinicians about what the important questions are and what the challenges the children are facing. Yeah, so I think the importance is how it can change practice and how we can help children and families.
Yeah, definitely. Krystal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the importance of identifying if there are difficulties with communication as early as possible is one of the big purposes of Better Speech and Hearing Month. And thinking about if you have a child that you suspect might not be hearing as well as you think they should be, that's definitely something to take to your pediatrician. And the same with if you think your child doesn't have as many words as maybe the other children in their daycare. Those are all things that are completely legitimate and rare, and pediatricians are very open to talking about those sorts of things with you.
Yeah, definitely. I just thought of this question, but I'm curious to know about how many studies do you put on at a time? Do you always have multiple going on? Do you do just a few a year? I think that would be interesting for everyone to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. We always have multiple studies going on. The studies tend to take a long time.
Yeah,
Um, and so if you just did one at a time, I guess you wouldn't get much done.
right.
So knowing that they're going to spread over years in most cases means that we're probably going to run, 3 or 4 or 5 at a time. Of course, some take longer than others. Like Krystal, I also have a longitudinal project going on, and so those are the ones where you're following the same children and families for multiple years. Obviously, by design, they take a long time.
Right.
So we kind of add other studies addressing more sort of short-term questions alongside that. I'm sure you do the same, don't you, Krystal? How many studies would you say you have going on at once?
Yeah, we almost always have multiple studies going on. In terms of the larger longitudinal type studies, we have one of those.
Okay.
But we'll keep it going as we often have intervention studies that are running. So we're starting those back up now that in-person services are more prevalent again. And we've also shifted to doing a lot of studies of telepractice and what are like that's a technology that I think is here to stay and has lots of benefits beyond the pandemic in terms of access to healthcare, particularly for folks who live in rural areas or who have difficulty finding the time or the resources to travel to a clinic. Telepractice has a lot of promise for providing equity of services. And so that's something that we've become really interested in. And specifically in our lab, how does providing telepractice, speech and language services, what are the specific challenges if a child has hearing loss?
Yeah.
And so thinking about how to really maximize the sound quality of telepractice and are there particular skills that are better addressed in person, and how to prioritize those sorts of things so that families are able to not spend all of their time trying to find intervention services, but really find a balance of getting great services and still having time to do all of your other family things that you like to enjoy.
Right. Yeah, and kudos to you for doing the legwork and figuring that out. And I love what you both said too, especially about how your research directly impacts, the work done in the clinics. Because sometimes I think we can think about, Boys Town Hospital Services and then Boys Town research as two separate things, when really they're hand in hand and they are always interconnected. And I'm sure the physicians and care providers at Boys Town learn just as much from the studies that you all put on that you also did. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's an ideal situation.
Yeah, that's great. So, how do these studies benefit the children and families that Boys Town serve?
Well, I think a number of ways. So, as I mentioned, we have a number of clinical and educational programs. So, for example, we run in association with Omaha Public Schools, we run a preschool program in our building for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And then we have a number of outpatient services for children who are coming to see a speech language pathologist or audiologist, once or twice a week, whatever, for some extra support. And so those children are, they're children from the community. And so I think we are providing supports for those children and their families. We also do provide speech language services and also conduct some research on the West Campus where the Boys Town home is. And the children who are residents at that home have a variety of communication needs. Of course, not all of them do, but many do. And so we're serving the Boys Town community that way too.
Yeah, that's great. Krystal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think so. In the written language lab, one of the things we really are focused on is how can we make sure that our work directly impacts patient care? And so a lot of the time that looks like us trying out different versions of interventions so we can really refine that in the lab and present a pretty solid product for clinicians to uptake in the clinic. And it certainly goes both ways, where we get to hear from clinicians what are the parts that are working, what are the parts that aren't working, and from the families, what are the parts that we've really enjoyed, what are the parts that have been difficult for us to put into place, and these are some things that might help with that. And so, like, really doing that behind the scenes work, one of the things that we have tried really hard to make a priority for the work that we do, so that that work is being done in the lab, and in clinical practice we have a pretty ready to go package of things that we can try. And I think so the question is really, how do the studies benefit Boys Town? But for us, we also think about, like, how do Boys Town clients benefit us? And so hearing people's stories and listening to families talk about, these are the things that have been really helpful for us, and these are the things that have been difficult, and this might have been more helpful, really helps us to know these are the kinds of topics that we should be focusing on, and these are the sorts of problems that people are encountering and that we're thinking about how can we problem solve them.
Yeah, always looking ahead, definitely. So we do have just a few more questions. So if you are watching live and you have a question, please go ahead and leave that in the comments now so we can make sure to get it answered, and also make sure you like this video. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this, but building on it, what else do you think is important for families to know during Better Speech and Hearing Month and beyond?
Yeah, I love this question. So I think I have two answers. One is that parents should trust themselves. If you have a concern about your child's communication development, that is valid. You should take that concern to your physician, or you can call directly to the speech language clinic. We're going to include that number for you with this video. Your concerns are always valid, and you know your child best. So if you feel like your child isn't communicating well, or as well as other children maybe in your family or neighborhood that are the same age, then that is a valid concern that you can act on and should act on. Um, I think related to that is knowing that sometimes naughty behavior is an attempt to communicate.
Yeah.
So if you're worried about your child kind of having tantrums or not following rules or etc., it could be because understanding spoken communication is a bit of a difficulty for your child, and so another reason to check. Um, yeah, and then I think the other message that is appropriate to share in Better Speech and Hearing Month is there's one important word left out of Better Speech and Hearing Month. So there's hearing, and we know what that means, and there's speech. That's how you articulate the sounds, right? But a child can have great hearing and very clear speech, but still have problems with language. So the language piece is not synonymous with the speech piece. So good hearing, good speech, but language could still be a struggle. And that's things like learning new words, making complete sentences, understanding complex sentences that are spoken to you. And those kinds of things are really essential for learning to read. So I think we should put in one of those little insert marks and
Yeah.
call it Better Speech Language and Hearing Month. All three are super important.
Yeah. I think that's great. I think we should petition to get it changed for next year with
Indeed.
that. Crystal, what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would also add, if you are a family that has older school age children and you're noticing that your child's having a difficult time learning to read, one of the things to think about is that they're, learning to read is basically taking language from a page. And when we're talking to each other, we're taking language from the sounds. But if you're having trouble learning to read, it's a good idea to check the language component as well, because that could be contributing. So your language is strong enough to have conversations, but when you have a more complex task like reading, you start to have a little bit of trouble. So if you see that there's difficulty learning to read, requesting a language evaluation, I think, is a really great idea, and also requesting a hearing evaluation. So we have a study from a few years ago in my lab where we were interested in children who had reading impairments, and we gave them all hearing screenings, and half of them failed their hearing screenings.
Wow.
So these are children who had really strong language skills, and they were having trouble learning how to sound out words.
Mm.
And so they had very mild hearing loss. So it wasn't apparent
Yeah.
in your everyday communication, but when you went to that specific task of learning to read, just that little bit of difficulty hearing was having a really big impact.
Yeah. And there are things, that we might totally miss, especially if it's that mild hearing loss. So if you are interested in getting your child's hearing screened or language screened, I will go ahead and leave those links in the comments of this video so you can request to get seen for that. Okay, so our last question is, how can families get involved with the labs and with the Center for Childhood Deafness, Language, and Learning if they are interested?
So, as you said, we're going to leave links and numbers for contacting the clinic. We can also put a link up for learning more about research and signing up to get notices about research studies that might be relevant or interesting to you and your child. And I really want to emphasize that although we've been putting our focus in this conversation on children who are finding learning to talk or read to be a challenge, we always need children of all levels of abilities and skills in our research studies. So even if even if you know that your child is an excellent communicator and reader with perfect hearing, we'd still love for you to explore the research that we're doing and maybe volunteer to be in a study, because we always need to represent our whole community and children with a range of abilities, strengths, and weaknesses. So
Yeah.
I would just encourage you to do that. The research studies are obviously they're always voluntary, but we try to make them as fun and game-like as possible for your child, age appropriate. There's compensation to help cover your travel expenses, or in some cases, we come to you, or like in Krystal's case, right to your living room because it's a telepractice
Yeah.
study. So there are all kinds of options, and I really encourage you to go to the link that we post and see what's going on.
Yes, definitely. So right after we wrap up here, I will link everything in the comments. If you're watching on YouTube, all of the links will be in the description of this video. And if you have any questions, if you're watching later on for Karla and Krystal, go ahead and comment or message our page, and I'm happy to facilitate a Q&A between you two. So thank you both so much for joining us. It was so interesting to learn more about what is happening with hearing and speech research at Boys Town. So thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for
All
having
right.
us.
Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.